Welcome to this session on Lincoln-Douglas debate. We'll be talking for the next few minutes about philosophy, the great philosophers, and the impact that they have on the conduct of Lincoln-Douglas debate, especially in the University Interscholastic League, where we take value debate very seriously. So first of all, an introduction to philosophy in general. These are the general categories of philosophy: metaphysics, study of the universe, the nature of reality; logic, what constitutes a valid argument; epistemology, the study of knowledge and how it's acquired; aesthetics, the study of art and beauty. But Lincoln-Douglas debate tends to focus more on the final two components of philosophy: politics, the study of political rights, government, the role of citizens in their government; and then ethics, the study of morality and how one should live the good life. I'd like to begin with a little discussion of stasis theory. You'll probably be introduced to stasis theory in your college English classes if you haven't already been introduced in high school. But stasis theory, we don't know exactly where it began. There was a fire in the library at Alexandria where a lot of ancient knowledge was lost. But we know that it was discussed generally in Aristotle's The Rhetoric, and then much more specifically in Hermagoras. And he's the one that's typically credited with the development of stasis theory. That was in the 1st century BC, but it finds its fullest explanation in Cicero's De Inventione. And in stasis theory, we're asking these 4 questions. Questions of fact: did a thing happen? Questions of definition: what kind of a thing was that happened? Questions of value: is the thing good or bad, worthy or unworthy? And then questions of policy: what should be done about this thing? This little outline of stasis theory helps us understand the various levels of debate that we engage in. So in the University Interscholastic League, we do policy debate, which focuses at the policy level. And we do Lincoln-Douglas debate, which focuses at the value level. Some of you may participate in high school in mock trial, later in law school in moot court, where you're actually debating whether a thing happened. Is someone guilty of a crime or not? Did Lee Harvey Oswald actually act alone when he killed John F. Kennedy? Those are questions of fact. What should we say about whether this thing happened? All forms of debate deal with definition in a very major way. But the point of this little discussion is that in Lincoln-Douglas debate, we try to phrase resolutions that focus on the stasis level of value. Is the thing good or bad? Is it wise or unwise? Is it worthy or unworthy? So keep that in mind as we go along. So how does value debate work, especially in Lincoln-Douglas debate? We like to think that every value resolution contains one or more objects of evaluation and certainly an evaluative term. So think about the topic: liberty is more precious than law. The objects of evaluation in that resolution are liberty and law. The evaluative term is more precious. So how do we decide what more precious means? Well, that kind of a resolution allows the debaters themselves to decide, okay, should the core value be justice? Should it be safety? Should it be peace? Should it be progress? Should it be the common good? Or many of the other things that we think of as core values. All of those could be used to define what is more precious than something else. But then there are some kinds of resolutions that actually specify the core value to be used. So consider the example of resolution: a just social order ought to place the principle of equality above that of liberty. So this resolution establishes justice as the standard for evaluation, because we're asking, what would a just social order do in evaluating those two terms? So with that background, let's just say that to the extent that we have stock issues in Lincoln-Douglas debate, these are the 3. What is the core value? What is the criterion for that value? And then how is that criterion met? So we have contentions in the affirmative or the negative case, talking about whether the criterion has been met for the particular core value that you've established. Major value controversies that we'll talk about as we go through various philosophers in these few minutes. The individual versus society. Capitalism versus socialism. Liberty or individualism versus the common good. Anthropocentrism, which means do we focus on the values of human beings, versus biocentrism. Do all beings have ethical claims, ethical rights? We had a Lincoln Douglas resolution in the UIL a few years ago, which focused particularly on that issue, anthropocentrism versus biocentrism. Then utilitarianism versus deontology. Deontology is a big word that just means, do we decide meaning before experience? Whereas utilitarians, they say, well, you have to think about consequences, because what is right or what is good is determined by what is best for the greatest number of people in the way that it plays out. But a deontologist, as we'll talk about with Rawls or with Kant later on, they would say, no, questions of justice, questions of right or wrong should be decided in the absolute before you even think about experience. And we'll talk about those philosophical points of view as we go along. Then when we talk about international relations, very often we're talking about the just war theory versus pacifism, sovereignty versus the social contract. And then more recently, issues of feminism versus patriarchy. And we haven't even included in this list racist questions about racism that really get into a lot of the issues that we've already talked about here. But we'll talk about some philosophers that get into those issues as well. So in a discussion of philosophy and major philosophers, you kind of have to start with the ancient Greeks, with Socrates. And Socrates, if you read the various dialogues of Socrates that have survived, and there are many of them, they're in the 70s of his dialogues that have survived. But for our Lincoln Douglas purposes, nothing more important than his dialogue, The Republic. And here, for the most part, Plato is describing the words of his teacher, Socrates, as he went around Athens interacting with various people. And many objects, many subjects come up in those discussions, but certainly justice, that Plato, when I say Plato, we're kind of always saying Plato / Socrates, because we don't truly know how much of what Plato wrote was his own opinion versus words that he was putting into the mouth of his teacher, Socrates. We don't have any of the writings of Socrates other than those that his student Plato provided. But in the Republic, Plato says, I think that justice belongs in the best class of goods, that which should be loved both for its own sake and for the sake of its consequences by anyone who is going to be blessed. So Plato is essentially playing both sides of the fence there with the utilitarians, the consequentialists, but also saying it's good for its own sake. And as we'll talk about later, philosophers like Rawls and Kant will emphasize, well, it should always be looked at on its own rather than as to its consequences. But Socrates / Plato started our discussion of justice. And then there's Plato's notion of aristocracy as the best form of government, but not just any aristocracy. His notion was that the philosopher king is best. We would all be better off to the extent that we would be ruled by the philosopher king. And his brand of philosopher, a man whose character and ambitions have been forged into those ideals for a just ruler through a rigorous education designed to train intellectuals that are selfless and upright, whose souls have been made calm and aware of the absolute good by learning the truth based on true ideas. So Plato / Socrates, they were believers in true forms that are known deeply in the soul. And the notion is the safest place to begin in the search for truth is with those truths that are just known innately in the human soul. Plato wrote about democracy, and he wasn't a fan. He believed that democracy generates into anarchy. Democracy means freedom, but that can be deceptive. Freedom is also slavery, he wrote. In democracy, the lower class grows bigger and bigger. People are free to do what they want, to live how they want. People can even break the law if they choose, and this ultimately leads to anarchy. So he wasn't a fan of democracy. The vision of the ideal state in Plato is the pursuit of everyone's interest. So we have a first introduction to the common good in Plato. There shouldn't be the advantage to any one city's factions. He was talking about the Greek city-states, but it's concerned with the common good of the whole political community and to the advantage of everyone. So the notion is we don't just have responsibilities to ourselves, but we have responsibility to the common good. It's one of the core values that you'll often confront in Lincoln-Douglas debate. And then one of the students of Plato, Aristotle. And while in my field of communication, we generally focus on Aristotle's work, The Rhetoric, 342 BC. In philosophy, his major work is the Nicomachean Ethics. And here we have an introduction to virtue ethics in Aristotle. The notion that happiness is the ultimate good, but it can only be achieved through virtue. And how do we approach a virtue? Well, Aristotle wrote about the golden mean, and he spends quite a bit of time talking about how the middle way between any two extremes is the most desirable. But Aristotle is also a fan of justice, and he argues that justice consists in what is lawful and fair, with fairness involving equitable distributions and the correction of what is inequitable. And he thinks justice is the primary virtue. Justice is more important than all of the other virtues. He says actually it encompasses all other virtues. Well, then we have a number of the Christian philosophers, and I'll skip over Augustine, St. Augustine, but St. Thomas Aquinas, certainly a major early Christian philosopher. He was born in Italy, but he taught at the University of Paris. And he writes extensively on just war theory from a Christian context. So, and by the way, he built quite a bit on the philosophy of Augustine in this regard. But in order for war to be just, it must occur for a good and just purpose, not the pursuit of wealth and power. It must be waged by a properly instituted authority like a state. And its central motive has to be peace. It can't be dominance. It can't be wealth. It can't be taking over someone's resources. And Aquinas also talks about the common good. For the sake of the common good, there must therefore be those who have the authority to decide which of the many reasonable and irreconcilable ideas will have the force of law, he wrote. And then we get into the Renaissance. And I know we're skipping a lot of philosophers, but we only have so much time. So we have Thomas Hobbes writing in the middle Renaissance. And well, there's more than one work. His primary work, The Theory of Individual Rights, the Leviathan. His key concepts, he is an early social contract theorist. But his social contract is quite a bit different from those who would come later. But Hobbes says that in the state of nature, life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. If you want to live by yourself, if you want to live as an individual in the state of nature, you're not going to have a happy life. And so we enter into the social contract and we give to the sovereign a lot of power in order to receive protection in return. And Hobbes wrote that the sovereign has 12 principal rights, and I'll list just the first few of them. But in his notion of the social contract, once power is given to the sovereign, it's pretty well just given. It's not to be taken back. So he says, for example, subjects can't change the form of government once the sovereign is given power. Subjects can't argue to be freed from the covenant, Later social contract theorists would talk about revolution, but not so for Hobbes. The sovereign has the power to do what is necessary to maintain the peace, and that's whatever is necessary, because peace is what people are asking for when they enter into the social contract. The sovereign is to be the judge in all cases. The sovereign will have the power to make war and peace. Number 6 is the most controversial in Hobbes. He says the sovereign has the right to censor the press and restrict free speech as necessary to maintain power. So Hobbes says there are several types of government, but he thinks monarchy is the best. And again, that distinguishes him from later social contract theorists. But for Hobbes, peace is an intrinsic good. Without peace, he says, no other human desire can be accomplished. So peace is primary, and we give up power to the sovereign in order to maintain peace. And about equality, he says this, okay, you can have equality in the state of nature, but that very equality threatens our existence. The only way to achieve the good society is to give authority to a sovereign who has the authority to regulate behavior. And the sovereign, according to Hobbes, is not required to create a society in which every person is treated equally. He says, anyway, that's impossible. The only way you have that is in the state of nature. And then you're continually at war in the state of nature, where your equality is being measured against everyone else's equality. So Hobbes is not a believer in distributive justice, and that puts him in opposition to Rousseau and Rawls and later contract theorists. According to Hobbes, safety can be achieved only by giving authority to a sovereign. So peace is prized above all because it represents the end of the war that obtains an end to the state of nature. So in Hobbes' version of the social contract, all notions of equality and distributive justice are subordinated to peace and to safety. That will be very different in later contract theorists. In John Locke, and probably the most famous work of Locke that you've heard about is an essay concerning human understanding, but for purposes of government, probably the most important work of John Locke is his second treatise of government. Locke was also a social contract theorist, but very different from Hobbes. He says that sovereignty resides in people, not in the government. And by the way, some of the very recent documents from the United Nations that attempt to redefine state sovereignty emphasize that very notion that finds its root back in John Locke. So the aim of a legitimate government is to preserve as much as possible the rights to liberty, to, well, as he says, to life, liberty, health, and the property of its citizens, and so to prosecute and punish those of its citizens who violate the rights of others and to pursue the public good. So within the social contract, according to Locke, the will of the people should prevail within certain limits. Laws must apply equally to all citizens and not favor particular or sectional interests. Very different from Hobbes in that regard. If the sovereign fails to provide the conditions under which people can enjoy their natural rights, then the people are entitled to remove him by force if necessary. Therefore, in Locke, there is a right of revolution. And obviously his writing had a lot to do with the philosophical background of the American Revolution and of the French Revolution. So Locke's writing had, a lot of his actual language was duplicated in the writing of the Declaration of Independence in its preamble, and later in the US Constitution. So a lot of impact on American government from John Locke. And then we have David Hume, who was in opposition to social contract theorists. Hume believes that this theory, the social contract theory, as he says, is repugnant to the common sentiments of mankind and to the practice and opinion of all nations and ages. He says there isn't even any example that he can find of an existing government that's been founded by a universal act of consent. There would be some who would later argue that the first example that Hume was looking for was in the United States in its formation. But he says, I don't find governments like that. Indeed, he says the notion of consent doesn't enter the minds of subjects who suppose themselves born under the obligations of obedience to a certain sovereign, nor of princes who claim their subjects as their property and assert their independent right of sovereignty from conquest or succession. So he says allegiance is a duty, and only those trained in the theory of social contract imagine this duty to be founded on consent. He says, in the world that I see, it's not founded on consent. So he thinks social contract theory is dangerous because it too readily grants a right of rebellion that destabilizes political society. So there's a duty of allegiance to one's government, which derives from utility, not from consent or agreement or promise. The reason why one has a duty to obey the government when one does obey the government is that such obedience maximizes the total happiness of society. So democracy for Hume is not intrinsically better than its competitors. It's only better if it produces better, more humane laws. The connection between democratic procedures and just/humane policies is contingent, not necessary. So in some societies, a benevolent despot might produce better legislation than rule by an intolerant, these are his words, intolerant, bigoted, bloodthirsty mob. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, more in the social contract camp of John Locke. And in his work, The Social Contract, the key concepts, man is born free, but everywhere in chains. So the social contract for Rousseau is the solution to that. In the social contract, there's no inherent conflict between freedom and authority. Instead, we exchange natural freedom for other kinds of freedom, civil freedom. And again, the writings of Rousseau had great impact on the American Revolution. Immanuel Kant. And we look to Immanuel Kant as the great rejecter of utilitarianism. So we haven't talked about utilitarians much yet, but utilitarians believe that the answer to what is just, what is right, has to look at consequences. But for Kant, this is not true. Justice, morality, should not be based on an evaluation of how it works out or of circumstances or consequences. Instead, such judgments about what is moral or just ought to be made a priori or prior to a consideration of consequences. So let me just give a contemporary example that can maybe give something of a picture of this. Suppose you're a high school principal and you're deciding whether to discipline a student. Before you decide what discipline you're going to mete out, do you want to look ahead to consequences like, okay, how much money does this student's family have? How much trouble will I be in with the school board if I suspend the student or send them to alternative school? Would I want to know those things, or should I answer questions of justice without any consideration of consequences? What's right is right, what's wrong is wrong. It should be decided a priori, prior to knowing experience, rather than the alternative, which is a posteriori, after thinking about the consequences. One of the great statements of Immanuel Kant, let justice be done though the world perish. You shouldn't have to ask when you're trying to decide what is the just or the right or the moral thing to do, but what would be the consequences if I did this? Now, while we think of Kant as one of the great Western philosophers, we do need to stop for just a moment and recognize that in Kant, as with some of the other philosophers that we've talked about, there is something of a racist strain. He proposes a hierarchy of 4 racial categories: white Europeans, Asians, Africans, Native Americans. Charles Mills, professor of philosophy at the City University of New York, wrote that Kant has been sanitized for public consumption. He says his racist works are conveniently ignored. Like many of his contemporaries, David Hume is another good example. He signed on to the notion of social Darwinism that gave implicit license to a European colonization of Africa and the New World. So remember, this is Kant is writing just before the period that we will get the writings of Charles Darwin. That's 1859, so half a century later. But after that time, there would be many social Darwinists who would marry the notion of evolution to notions about hierarchy of races. And Kant was actually one who created something of a preface to that. Jeremy Bentham, in his introduction to the principles of morals and legislation, he's one of the first, often viewed as the first utilitarian, though we should recognize there were also some ancient Greeks who wrote in opposition to Socrates / Plato / Aristotle, who were consequentialists or utilitarians. But we think of the origin of utilitarianism in Western thought going back to Jeremy Bentham. So we should make decisions, according to Bentham, about what is right and just based on what increases pleasure and minimizes pain. So that's an early statement of utilitarianism, but one of the things that Bentham added to that is that should apply to animals as well as to people. Bentham thought that animals, because, well, here's how he phrased it. The question is not, can animals reason, nor can animals talk, but can they suffer? Why should the law refuse its protection to any sensitive being? So Bentham, we think of as the first Western philosopher to grant animals equal consideration from within a comprehensive non-religious moral theory, and he was a staunch defender of early animal welfare laws. He did approve of the killing and using of animals as long as pointless cruelty could be avoided in that process. Well, you'll notice that up to this point, the philosophers that we've looked at have had something in common. They've all been white and they've all been men. So many critics say this is a great mistake that we make in Western philosophy. And we've ignored the writings of feminists, we've ignored women philosophers, even going back to the time of the Greeks, because there were some. But Mary Wollstonecraft is an early feminist philosopher and wrote in 1797 A Vindication of the Rights of Women. And she wrote that women are socialized to be frivolous and incapable. And she called for the education of women so that they could develop their independent worth and wealth, by the way. And she had little political influence in her own time. She was kind of viewed as an outlier, but later came to be viewed as a founder of modern feminism and certainly had significant influence on women's rights pioneers such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Margaret Fuller. Well, let's talk about Hegel. Hegel, in Phenomenology of Spirit, emphasizes freedom. Freedom, though, must be balanced by affirming the ethical life and common bonds. So he talks about this tension between individual freedom, of which he was a champion, but also that a consideration of freedom has to include questions of what constitutes the ethical life. So it's kind of a beginning of some of the communitarian philosophy that would later be more fully developed. And also Hegel wrote, the state has the responsibility to care for the poor. So we have kind of an early shadowing of what we would get in a major dose later in John Rawls. So this conception of freedom in Hegel argues that in the fulfillment of one's ethical obligations, freedom is always in tension with duty, and you can't fully examine one without examining the other. And of course, Hegel is the great philosopher who talks about the tension between things. And he talks about how, you have thesis, you have antithesis, and then you have synthesis. And so it's almost like he's borrowing or giving a fuller statement to Aristotle's notion of the golden mean. So many truths can be realized through the synthesis of opposites. So Hegel was a great theorist that talked about how thesis, antithesis leads to synthesis. And then in Lincoln Douglas philosophy, we draw very heavily on John Stuart Mill, especially in his work on liberty. Mill also was a great advocate of utilitarianism. But there are two kinds of utilitarians that philosophers write about. There are act utilitarians and rule utilitarians. Jeremy Bentham, that we talked about before, is an act utilitarian. So an act is deemed morally right when it creates the best results for the greater number of people. Nothing is right or wrong in and of itself, but instead you have to look at how the consequences of that act play out. But act utilitarianism creates some moral problems. So suppose we need to locate and stop a mass murderer. Would it be moral, right / just to torture the murderer's child until she discloses where her father is hiding? And so people that have looked at the various problems of act utilitarianism have many of those kinds of examples. The alternative is, in Mill, among utilitarians, what's called a rule utilitarianism. So Mill wrote that an act is morally correct if it follows a morally correct rule. A rule can only be judged as morally correct if its application over time, not just in a particular or a single instance, but if over time that rule is found to produce the greatest happiness for the greatest number. So John Stuart Mill was a rule utilitarian. We use experience in order to determine the rules that create the greatest happiness for the greatest number. But one of the great notions that we have from John Stuart Mill is the marketplace of ideas. Mill rejected the notion of dogmatic certainty, which means if you can't know that you just know inherently that your attitude or belief is right, then you should allow all ideas to be expressed. If a dogma is truly good and right, it should be able to stand against all comers. It should be able to defend itself against all contrasting ideas. On the other hand, if the dogma is in error, then allowing all ideas in the marketplace will expose the error. And as a matter of fact, he adds to that dogmas become dead dogmas if they are not allowed to be examined. If you just say, no, we're not going to allow anyone to question whether this is true or not, that's the way that dogmas die out. Also, Mill is a proponent of the harm principle. So he holds that liberty should be the primary value unless there's a legitimate reason for restricting liberty, and that would be to protect against harm to others. So interference with one's personal liberty can be justified if it's shown that it produces harm for others. So another way of simply putting it, my right to swing my fist ends where your nose begins. And then Mill was a proponent of democracy. So one person can't be depended on to determine what will produce the greatest good for the greatest number. That's why you need the will of the majority, and that's democracy. So again, Mill was a proponent of freedom to the greatest extent possible. He says despotism, another reason that he advocates democracy, despotism crushes individuality, and individuality is essential to well-being. Henry David Thoreau, to the extent that you want to argue that civil disobedience can be justified, there's no more obvious authority than Henry David Thoreau, the American philosopher, in his writing Civil Disobedience, 1849. Disobedience is appropriate when the state is unjust. So he says there is an authority more important than obeying the law and the government, one's own conscience. The individual has the ultimate responsibility. It's the higher law. So his statement is, in wildness is the preservation of the world, which was later adopted by the Sierra Club as its motto. Walden Pond is another one of his writings. He's a big believer in just wildness and getting out away from society. And in one lecture, he writes this: I wish to speak a word for nature, for absolute freedom and wildness, as contrasted with a freedom and culture merely civil. Humans are part and parcel of nature rather than a member of a society. So again, Thoreau, the great defender of civil disobedience, and on Walden Pond and his essay on civil disobedience, that's a description of his own decision not to pay his taxes. Someone else ended up paying them for him so he could be let out of jail, but which kind of upset him. But he didn't believe in the American government's conduct of the war in Mexico. And so to protest that war, he refused to pay his taxes, which was a very small amount at that time. Karl Marx. In the whole discussion of capitalism versus socialism, certainly the elephant in the room philosopher is Karl Marx, who was one of the authors of the Communist Manifesto, but also Das Kapital. And his argument at length is that capitalism is based on the exploitation of nature. He expressed a belief that capitalist societies will inevitably be replaced by socialism over time. And so in the section of the manifesto, Bourgeois and Proletarians, Marx writes that the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle. An oppressed majority is exploited under the yoke of an oppressive minority. In capitalism, the industrial working class or the proletariat engage in class struggle against the owners of the means of production, the bourgeoisie. This struggle will end in a revolution that restructures society. The bourgeoisie, through the constant revolutionizing of production and uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, have emerged as the supreme class in society, displacing all the old powers of feudalism. The bourgeoisie constantly exploits the proletariat for its labor power, creating profit for themselves and accumulating capital. However, in doing so, the bourgeoisie serves as its own grave diggers. The proletariat inevitably will become conscious of their own potential. They will rise to power through revolution, overthrowing the bourgeoisie. And of course, had a great deal to do with the Russian Revolution, which didn't end up working as well as many had hoped. And so there ended up being, certainly in this country, quite a bit of disappointment from early theorists of communism and socialism. And then we have the philosopher Nietzsche, who was an opponent really of morality, you'd have to say. And in Beyond Good and Evil, writes that morality is a fiction. He writes that the human species would be healthier if all morality were to be abandoned. In particular, he believed that Christianity promoted weakness and that we'd all be better off accepting natural instincts rather than teaching that weakness is some kind of a value. So even though Nietzsche, argued against Christianity, neither was he a fan of atheism. He believed that all beliefs, all dogmas should be abandoned. He believed that an affirmation of life would require the elimination of all dogma. He also wrote that being does not exist. Everything is in a state of becoming. So it's not static. And he also wrote of something that he called will to power. And it comes more from his work, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And he writes, the universe is made up of wills. Whose will be exerted? This could appear as violence or physical dominance, but it can also be turned inward, as represented by a determination to pursue the mastery of self. So humans, he says, are not a given, but always in a state of flux where nothing is determined. And again, up to this point, we haven't looked at any African-American philosophers, and certainly modern philosophy has critiqued for that. Let me take just a moment to talk about W.B. Du Bois, one of the founders of the NAACP, the first African-American to earn a doctorate from Harvard University. And he was the great opponent of Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington, another African-American who in his 1895 Atlanta Exposition address encouraged his fellow African-Americans to apply themselves in the world of commerce. They could find their way in this world if they just worked hard. But Du Bois said that's not the answer to racism, that we shouldn't just accept the denial of opportunity and the necessity to work harder than everyone else. Du Bois urged higher education as the better route to change, and in a point of view that has become controversial even in some African-American circles, he urged a notion of, the necessity of, he talked about the 10th, the need for his fellows to become highly educated and to change society from that point of higher education. He also wrote about something called double consciousness that's hard to explain. But he says, for African Americans, there arises a painful self-consciousness, an almost morbid sense of personality and a moral hesitancy, which he says is fatal to self-confidence. The worlds within and without the veil of color are changing and changing rapidly, but not at the same rate, not the same way. And this produces a peculiar wrenching of the soul, a peculiar sense of doubt and bewilderment. Such double life with double thoughts, double duties, double social classes must give rise to double words and double ideals, and tempt the mind to pretense or revolt, to hypocrisy or radicalism. Talked about how in this society, for an African American, fitting in can put them at war with themselves and create, ironically, a sense of questioning blackness in and of itself. And Du Bois found that terribly troubling. And others later in trying to deal with that would talk about black is beautiful and the need to change the black-white metaphors that are used in society that create the sense that black is somehow not as good as white in the many metaphors that we use in society. Another African-American, Anna Julia Cooper, wrote A Voice from the South by a Black Woman of the South in 1892. And she described at a very early point how the interlocking systems of racism, race, gender, class, oppression, all combine to create problems, not just for Blacks, but for Black women in particular. So she was an early Black feminist, and she called for a more honest recognition of the spatial contribution that every racial group has made to human progress. And then we have Ayn Rand, who really didn't so much write works of philosophy as novels, works of fiction, but nevertheless that came to represent philosophical points of view, and is certainly one of the major advocates of an extreme form of individualism in opposition to socialism. And she came by her opposition to socialism and communism naturally. She was born in Russia under a different name, Zinoyevna Rosenbaum. She took the name Ayn Rand. Her father's business was confiscated after the Russian Revolution. She visited the United States in 1925 and determined to set up her life in the United States. Her name is often mispronounced. She herself said, if you want to pronounce my name correctly, understand it should rhyme with line. So it should be pronounced Ayn Rand. Through a novel, Atlas Shrugged, and other novels, The Fountainhead, she presented a new moral philosophy, the morality of rational self-interest. It defended objectivism. So this novel features a dystopian picture of the United States where the most creative industrialists, scientists, artists rebel against the welfare state by going on strike, moving to a region where they establish their own free economy, where the fruits of their labor and genius are not appropriated by government. She essentially argues that without the individual efforts of society's most rational and productive people, the economy would collapse and society would fall apart. So she's an extreme advocate of individualism, was, I should say. And then we have John Rawls, often viewed as the greatest philosopher of the 20th century. Wrote a Theory of Justice in 1971, the Harvard philosopher. And Rawls argued a view of justice that builds upon Immanuel Kant, the notion that justice should be evaluated on its own merits, a priori, argues against utilitarianism. And the two principles in Rawls, the first principle, every person has the same claim to a fully adequate scheme of equal basic liberties. And that scheme is compatible with the same scheme of liberties for all. Doesn't see a conflict there. But the second principle, to the extent that there are inequalities in society, and he recognizes that sometimes it's inevitable that there are some, this should always satisfy two conditions. There should always be a fair equality of opportunity. And then, very importantly, and secondly, to the extent that there are differences, those differences must provide the greatest benefit to the least advantaged members of society. That's part of his definition of justice. And he refers to this as the difference principle. The difference principle permits diverging from strict equality so long as the equalities in question will make the least advantaged in society better off than they would be under strict equality. And then in stark and direct opposition to Rawls, we have Robert Nozick, another American philosopher who writes in Anarchy, State, and Utopia that individualism is the primary value. So this is rights-oriented libertarianism. He's the leading, well, I wouldn't say leading, the utilitarians point to a number of Austrian philosophers. But Nozick, the most commonly recognized writer in general philosophy, defender of libertarianism. So this is a total rejection of utilitarianism. He writes, there is no social entity with a good that undergoes some sacrifice for its own good. There are only individual people, different individual people with their own individual lives. Using one of these people for the benefit of others uses him and benefits the others, nothing more. What happens is that something is done to him for the sake of others. Talk of an overall social good covers this up. So he says the common good, the social good, should never override individual rights. Libertarianism is a statement that the individual is primary. Charles Mills, another African-American philosopher, writer of the racial contract, not the social contract, discloses how philosophical conceptions of the social contract have in fact incorporated white supremacy in a sneaky way. So he writes, the exploitation of bodies, land, and resources of always privileged whites. This is inherent in the nature of liberal democratic capitalism. So let me just read to you a little bit from the preface to his book. A standard undergraduate philosophy course will start off with Plato and Aristotle, perhaps say something about Augustine, Aquinas, and Machiavelli, move on to Hobbes, Locke, Mill, and Marx, and then wind up with Rawls and Nozick. It will introduce you to the notions of aristocracy, democracy, absolutism, liberalism, representative government, socialism, welfare capitalism, and libertarianism. But though it covers more than 2,000 years of Western political thought and runs the ostensible gamut of political systems, there will be no mention of the basic political system that has shaped the world for the past several hundred years. And this omission is not accidental. Rather, it reflects the fact that standard textbooks and courses have, for the most part, been written and designed by whites who take their racial privilege so much for granted that they don't even see it as political. It is a form of domination. What is needed, in other words, is a recognition that racism, or as I will argue, global white supremacy, is itself a political system, a particular power structure of formal or informal rule, socioeconomic privilege, and norms for the differential distribution of material wealth and opportunities, benefits and burdens, rights and duties. Judith Butler is a contemporary, I want to say feminist, but Butler's key argument is that gender is best perceived as performative, which means it has a social audience. It suggests that the performances of women are compelled and enforced by historical social practice. So for Butler, the script of gender performance is effortlessly transmitted generation to generation in the form of socially established meanings. She argues that feminism has made a big mistake in trying to make women a discrete ahistorical group with common characteristics. She writes that this approach reinforces the binary view of gender relations. And so, while it's difficult to capture really all of her writing, the key is that we need to reject binary sex distinctions as natural facts. Gender is performative. It's not something that's biologically determined or given. Peter Singer, to the extent that you have a resolution that deals with animal rights, Peter Singer, still with us, author of Animal Liberation and Practical Ethics, 2 different works. He's an advocate of veganism, utilitarianism, but equal consideration for all living creatures. And he's also an opponent of what he calls speciesism. So Singer argues there's a moral imperative to reduce the suffering of non-human animals, but also a moral imperative to reduce poverty and suffering among humans. Citizens of rich nations, he says, are morally obligated to give at least some of their disposable income to help the global poor. He uses the drowning child analogy, which states that most people would rescue a drowning child from a pond, even if it meant that their expensive clothes were ruined. So we clearly value a human life more than the value of our material possessions. As a result, we should take a significant portion of the money that we spend on our possessions and instead donate to charity. Of utilitarianism, the greatest good of the greatest number, he says it's the only measure of good or ethical behavior. And he says there's no reason not to apply this principle to other animals other than humans. He argues that the boundary between human and animal is completely arbitrary, and thus his attack on speciesism. There's no reason to privilege humans over other animals, and he argues in favor of the equal consideration or interests of all sentient beings. So we certainly have not examined in this short time all major philosophers or philosophies, but I wanted to give you a brief look at the great philosophers that should serve to illustrate the incredible educational opportunity that Lincoln Douglas debate offers to our students, especially the UIL brand of Lincoln Douglas debate that retains a commitment to value orientation in our debating practices. One of the experiences that I had at Baylor University for about 15 years was to teach as part of our the Baylor Interdisciplinary Core, which is an alternative to the standard core at Baylor and emphasizes a great books approach, great philosophers approach. And one of the things that I certainly observed is that students that came to us that had a background in Lincoln Douglas debate were already well steeped in an understanding of philosophy, granted mainly Western philosophy, but also had been introduced to questioning some of the basic values that we've founded our notions of value upon. And so in UIL Lincoln Douglas debate, again, we try to fight the good fight in continuing to phrase resolutions which have a value focus, because we recognize the importance of providing a different experience for high school debaters than just the experience they would get in policy debate, where they focus on policies. But Lincoln Douglas debate traditionally focusing on values, and there's a great benefit to taking the time to understand the values that undergird our thinking. So thank you for joining in this video, and good luck this year with Lincoln Douglas debate.